Mr. President, thank you. And Lance Bombardier, that was a fine speech, and I would have you in my trench any day, because it struck me that if anybody is prepared to fight, you are. Although I did pick up, what I saw was my colleague Tobias talking about the need for a Marshall Plan to rebuild Ukraine, rather than, I think, martial law in this country. A fine distinction, nevertheless. I have to confess to some disquiet at the notion of an old general telling young men and women that they should fight, because it is young men and women who all too often pay the costs of war, as we've seen with Mark today. Although I plead some mitigation on the basis that as a younger man, and indeed perhaps not so young man, I have also fought, so have some understanding of war and why we should do everything we can to avoid it, and why peace is precious, expensive, and must be paid for to avoid the cost of blood and treasure of war. Now, in my experience as a soldier, we fight for our mates. To be honest, the notion of fighting for a distant politician is pretty far from the mark. Although I can tell you the loyalty inspired by our late lamented Colonel-in-Chief, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, was exceptionally powerful. But I think in this context, fighting for king and country is a metaphor for fighting for everything that we hold dear: our families, our loved ones, our homes, our way of life, our liberty, our democracy, our freedom, our rule of law. Now, context is everything. 90 years ago, in this house, when that original debate took place, Hitler had been Chancellor of Germany, democratically elected for just 9 or 10 days. The Reichstag fire, the enabling laws, Dachau, as we heard earlier, the persecution of the Jews, and the Nazi destruction of democracy in Germany were all still to come, as was the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, the occupation of Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. So those who voted for that motion 90 years ago today had not lived through the events which we, with the benefit of hindsight, can see as waymarkers to the carnage of 1939-45. And of course, when war did break out, as we could see from the 8 names there, and the thousands that Tobias mentioned, your predecessors, my predecessors, signed up for the colours. My father was an undergraduate at Exeter College. He went up in 1938, and in 1939, at the end of the Trinity term, he did not go back to Exeter. He went to the recruiting office in Oxford and signed up as a rifleman in the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. 6 years later, he came back, an infantry major, wounded in Burma, with a military cross and a mention in dispatches. He was lucky. Many of his friends and contemporaries did not come back. Well, what of today's context? And if we look at Putin and Russia, we have got the benefit of hindsight. We know what he's done. We know what he is doing. And we know what he is likely to do. He has form. We've had our Rhineland moment, arguably, with the invasion of Georgia in 2008. We've had our Sudetenland moment with the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, and the proxy invasion of Ukraine's eastern provinces, and the subsequent war in Ukraine, which up until the 24th of February last year had killed something like 10,000 Ukrainians. And we have watched in horror after the 24th of February. Invasion, brutal occupation, destruction of cities, the use of mass rape as a weapon of war, deportation of children to Russia, mass killings of Ukrainian civilians, in a word, the attempted genocide of the Ukrainian people. And we know because Putin has told us that Ukraine is only the start. And if he could, and he can't right now because he's fixed in Ukraine, he would move on to other post-Soviet republics, Georgia, Moldova. He would almost certainly have a go at the Baltic states as well. Not Soviet republics, free countries annexed by the empire of the Soviet Union, our friends in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, proud NATO members, and if he goes for them, that means war with Russia on a massive scale, a third world war. And you can forget about volunteer services when that happens. So I think it's reasonable to assume that he's on a mission to rebuild the Russian Empire. He said as much. And once again, in Europe, we have a blood-stained autocrat prepared to inflict unspeakable damage and destruction and suffering on a liberal, democratic, neighboring state. We've been here before, and we face a similar challenge to that generation of undergraduates in 1938 and 39, who acknowledged that the freedoms that they enjoyed had to be fought for. They did not want to fight, but they knew they had to. And they saw it through to the end in 1945. What does the future look like? Well, the reality is this. There will never be peace in Europe while Putin is in the Kremlin. And don't assume that when Putin goes, he'll be replaced by some olive branch waving liberal, because he won't. He's likely to be replaced by somebody equally hardline, equally ultranationalist, and equally hell-bent on rebuilding a Russian empire at the expense of Ukraine as a sovereign state.
Point of information?
Can I finish first, please? We have to know Russia has only been an empire. It has never been a sovereign state in the way that France or Britain since the Act of Union or Germany since the unification in 1871 has been. It has been an empire, and the history of Russia has been one of expansion, of overreaching itself, of contracting, of recovering, and then expanding again. So the implications are profound and long-term. The only way Russia will become a peaceful, democratic state abiding by the rule of law internationally is if what was done to Germany in 1945 is done to Russia. And that is never going to happen.
When do we go to war for that?
Let me finish that. Therefore, that leaves us with one challenge. We have to deter war. We have to provide protection to Ukraine. We have to face up to the reality that we have to fight a second Cold War to prevent a third World War. And that means that we have to rebuild our armed forces. We have to establish a capability for civil defense. We have to learn the lessons of the Cold War. Because deterrence means capability, it means credibility, and it means communicating that. Yes, of course, there's got to be communication and dialogue, and diplomacy absolutely has a part. But at the end of the day, you have to be prepared to fight. And that means that we as a nation, however much we don't want to, have to accept that if it comes to us to have to fight, we've got to do that. In Trotsky's chilling words, you may not want this war, but this war will want you. And the only way to respond to that, I think, is the old Roman adage, if you want peace, prepare for war. And that means being prepared to fight. Thank you.